my name is Deanna Gabriel. This is the Cannabis Therapy Institute's tincture making class. Today we're going to go over the basic preparation methods for making a cannabis alcohol tincture. So to define a tincture, basically a tincture is a liquid extract of a plant material. For today's class, we'll be extracting cannabis into an alcohol solution. Tinctures can also be made using a variety of alcohols. They can be made using vinegar, glycerin, but as I said, for today's purposes, we'll focus on the alcohol extraction. As we dive into the tincture making process, I want to start off by kind of defining what herbal medicine making is to me. In my view, herbal medicine making is an art form. So to liken it to painting, an artist that's going to, say, create a watercolor painting will perhaps learn a few basic skills about how to create that watercolor. They may take a class, learn how the watercolors interact with their chosen medium, learn basic skills for creating their picture, and then from there, the creation is theirs, and it's about the creative force. And I see herbal medicine making being very similar. Once you learn the basic steps, the basic template for creating botanical medicines, it's really important to allow your creative energy to shine through in your medicine. Basically learn the steps and then let your intuitive forces flow and change the rules. Make it up as you go along, follow your instincts, and your medicine will benefit from that. So to start off on our tincture making journey, I want to offer you a few definitions. We've talked a little bit about what a tincture is, the liquid extract of a plant material. But within that, there are a few other terms that are important to define. One of the first terms would be the menstruum, which is a technical term for basically the liquid portion of the tincture. So today we'll be using alcohol. We're going to use 100% grain alcohol as our menstruum. Another definition that's important to define as you're learning your technical words is the mark. And the mark is basically the plant material that you're using in the tincture making process. And then the final definition that's important to know is maceration. So maceration is the time that it takes for the plant material to extract into the liquid solution. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the different types of menstruums that can be used for cannabis tincture making and tincture making in general. I've mentioned alcohol. Within alcohol, there are several choices. For cannabis, I like to use 100% grain alcohol. Cannabis extracts best at a 95% alcohol solution. Everclear or other grain alcohols like it happens to be about 95% alcohol, so it makes it very convenient for medicine making. Other people may choose to do their medicine in brandy, in vodka. Those are two classic additional alcohols that can be used. Some people use those alcohols because they're a little softer than Everclear. Everclear does have a little bit of a harsh edge because of the high alcohol content. Standard vodkas, standard brandies have a little more water mixed in and are usually somewhere around 60% alcohol. Now when you're making a cannabis tincture, using an alcohol that has a lower alcohol percentage will still turn out an effective medicine. Some of the constituents that are found in cannabis will be extracted into the water medium as well. THC likes the alcohol better, so it's thought that a cannabis tincture made with Everclear will have a higher THC content if it's extracted in a higher alcohol content. So you can make that choice. Today we're going to use Everclear because I like the 95% alcohol. So when you set out to make your cannabis tincture, one of the first steps that's important is decarboxylating the plant material. Now cannabis, as it's growing, contains THC in an acid form. In order to convert that acid form into its known psychoactive form, heat is needed. This happens during smoking with fire, but when you're making an extract of cannabis into alcohol for a tincture, you need to add that heat in a particular step at the beginning of the tincture process. So an easy way to do it, if you're making medicine in your home, is to simply get a baking dish that has a lid, put your cannabis inside the baking dish, cover it up, place this dish in a 200-degree oven for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, making sure to check stir the cannabis. Make sure that the oven is not too hot so that the cannabis is scalding or sticking to the sides in any way. So after about 15 or 20 minutes, pull your cannabis dish out of the oven, take the lid off, give it a quick stir, make sure that all the cannabis is fine, drop the lid back on. If everything looks okay and nothing is burning, go ahead and put it back into the oven for another 10 or 15 minutes, then pull it out. When you pull it out of the oven to cool, it's really important to leave the lid on your dish. This will help to preserve very valuable essential oils that are found in the plant material. Essential oils are really delicate plant elements, and they're very susceptible to heat and light. So when you heat your cannabis up, it releases all of those essential oils into the container. As the essential oils cool, they will settle back down onto the plant material, and you'll still have those available to your medicine as you extract it in the alcohol. So the first step in tincture making is to do this decarboxylation process, so you convert that THC acid into the psychoactive form of THC, which for many people offers great medicinal relief. You can choose to skip this step if you're not trying to capture that particular quality of THC. You can simply extract your cannabis into the alcohol without the decarboxylation step. That may reduce the psychoactive experience for patients if you have a patient that's not interested in capturing that particular healing quality of cannabis. So after you've decarboxylated your plant material and let it cool with the lid on, it's a good idea to use a grinder to take that bud or trim material and break it down into a finer powder. That's going to help the extraction process by increasing surface area that's available for pulling the medicine out into the alcohol solution. So you're tincturing basically any form of cannabis that you wish. You can tincture all trim, you can tincture all bud, you can tincture a combination of the two. Many people will choose to tincture mostly trim due to the cost of tincturing quality bud. But often during a harvest, there are many smaller buds that can be harvested, and they make great additions to tincture medicines or oil infusions. They're great medicine-making tools. So after you've heated up your bud or trim or combination, drop the medicine into a grinder. A small coffee grinder is often really a useful tool to have in the kitchen when you're making your own cannabis medicines. It's really important to make sure that your grinder is clean and hasn't been used for coffee, because the coffee oils are very difficult to clean out of the grinder, and often you will end up with a coffee-flavored cannabis tincture, which to some of you may be delightful, but others might regret that choice. So I usually suggest to people that they just get a grinder that's used only for their cannabis medicine-making needs so that they don't have that complication. So once the bud is cool, then grind it up in the grinder. You'll get a powder consistency that's, at any degree you want us to grind it to. Often, now this is sage for our purposes today. We don't have cannabis in the room with us, but we're using a substitute of sage. So you want to make sure that you have a pretty fine powder. One element that you'll want to watch out for is to not grind the material too fine. It certainly won't hurt the medicine. In fact, it might make your medicine slightly stronger, but it will affect the straining at the end. You'll have a hard time straining out all the particles that you've powdered down. So just get a nice medium powder for your cannabis extraction, and it will be fine. So after you've heated and ground your cannabis material, the next step is to get a weight. So there's a couple different ways, before we go into why you want to weigh your medicine, there are a couple different ways that you can make a cannabis tincture. One way is to do a measured method, and this is the method that I recommend because it produces exact results. You have an exact measurement of what is in your medicine, which is kind of a common problem with cannabis medicine making, is the strengths, the effectiveness vary quite dramatically from one tincture to another because there's not a consistency in the production. So in using the measured method, as you look at your notes, you'll see two forms of tincture making. The measured method will allow you to create a consistent product, so you'll know exactly what's in your medicine, and it's the method that I recommend. So we're going to start there. So to make a measured method tincture, basically it is weighing out your plant material and putting it into a particular ratio of plant material to liquid solution. A common ratio for herbal medicine is a ratio of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Now, cannabis, because of its strength, often extracts quite nicely in a 1 to 10 solution. So that's the ratio that we're going to use today, is a 1 to 10. So what that means is for every 1 part of cannabis, you have 10 parts of liquid. That 1 part can vary. It could be 1 ounce, it could be 1 pound, it could be a 1/4 ounce. Whatever amount of cannabis you wish to tincture, simply weigh that out in ounces, or you can work in grams as well. If you're working in ounces, the ratio will be 1 ounce or 1 part by ounces of your plant material to 5 or 10 liquid ounces of your menstruum, meaning your alcohol or your glycerin or your vinegar. If you're using the measured method and you would like to work in the metric system, your weight of your plant material will be done in grams. So let's say you have 28 grams of plant material. You would multiply 28 by 5 to get a 1 to 5 ratio, or you would multiply 28 by 10 to get a 1 to 10 ratio. So you can choose the system that works best for you if you'd like to work in ounces or if you'd like to work in grams to milliliters. For ease today, we are going to work in grams. So the first step of actually getting the measured method tincture prepared once you've done your heating and grinding is to get a weight. Now today we're going to weigh out 28 grams of our cannabis substitute, sage. And an easy way to do this in your home is to go to an office supply store and simply get a postage scale. Postage scales will often be a great tool to have in your kitchen for medicine making. So we have 28 grams here. The postage scale is pretty simple. There's quite a few varieties available. But it's nice to have the feature of being able to switch from ounces to grams so that you can work within the system that you choose. So we've weighed out 28 grams of our plant material. The next step is to pour that into a mason jar. So we'll take the lid off a mason jar. You'll want to make sure that you have the appropriate size of mason jar so that you can accommodate all of the liquid that you're going to need. So we'll scoop this into the jar. And like I said, you can use for your cannabis material sweet leaf or trim. You can use small kind of scraggly buds. You can use big beautiful buds from your plant if you'd like. Whatever feels right to you. And again, that comes back to the artist's edge to this work, to being the herbal artist. So we've got 28 grams of our plant material in a jar. We're making a 1 to 10 solution here, and we're working in the metric system. So we've measured out 28 grams of plant material. The next step is to simply measure out 280 milliliters of liquid, which is going to be alcohol. So it's a good idea to make sure that you have measuring tools in your kitchen that either work in ounces or in milliliters. A standard Pyrex measuring cup will work for either one of those. They typically have ounces on one side, milliliters on the other. So we'll pour out (280 milliliters of alcohol. And here's the magic moment. This is the moment that everyone will probably go, wow, that's making a tincture. It's so easy. So now once you've measured out your liquid, you simply pour it over the plant material. Give it a stir. Make sure that all the plant material is well covered. It's important to make sure that the plant material is covered by the alcohol solution for a couple of reasons. One, you want to make sure that as you are making your medicine, that all of the material is extracting into the alcohol so that your medicine is stronger. But two, you want to guard your medicine against any spoilage, so growing any mold or bacteria things of that nature. So it's important to make sure that the alcohol solution is covering all of your plant material so that it can act as an effective preservative against bacteria or mold growth. So at this point, our measured method tincture is ready to macerate. And if you remember in our definitions what maceration means, maceration is essentially the time that it takes to make a tincture. So after you've blended all of your ingredients together into your mason jar, the standard maceration time is about 4 weeks. Some people will harvest their tincture at 2 weeks and find that the product is acceptable. But in the herbal community at large, it's considered standard to let your tinctures macerate for 4 weeks. So before you drop your tincture off for maceration, you want to make sure to put a label on it. Elements that are important on the label, definitely the name of the plant. So in this situation, we're working with cannabis. If you happen to know the strain that you're tincturing, it's a really good idea to include that in on the label so that you know this is a sour diesel tincture or this is a blend of blueberry and kush together in a tincture. Some people really like to know what strains they're working with. So put the strain on your label if you know that. Another really important element to put on the label is that ratio that we talked about. So is this a tincture that was made in a 1:5 or a 1:10 ratio, 1:15? That will tell you how strong your medicine is. And as an industry, as we begin to start putting these labels on our tincture and working with making medicine within these standard herbal medicine ratios, we'll begin to understand a little bit more about how to effectively suggest dosages because our medicine will be more consistent. So we've got the name of the plant on the label, the ratio for strength. The date is also really important. This will help you know when harvest time comes. If you want to wait 4 weeks, then you look at your date on your tincture and you know when it's time to harvest. But it's also important as you harvest the tincture, strain it out and store it to know how old the tincture is. And any other creative elements you want to put on there. If you used Everclear, put Everclear on the label. If you used vodka, put vodka on the label. Whatever you're tincturing in, it's important to write that down as well, especially if you're planning on experimenting with a number of different menstruums to create your tincture. So after you've labeled your tincture appropriately, in order to macerate effectively, you want to make sure that your tincture is stored in a place that is cool and relatively dark. So you certainly would not want to set your tincture in a sunny window. It's best to set it in a cupboard or a closet, or if you have a dark corner in your kitchen, pantry, something like that. Basically, herbal medicine is a little fragile to heat and light. So sunlight can often damage the constituents in your plant material. It can also heat up the plant material to the point that it could encourage some bacteria, mold growth in your tincture, which is not what we're after. So make sure you're storing your tincture in an appropriate location for the maceration time. It's also really important as your tincture is macerating to visit the tincture daily and shake it. This will ensure that the plant material is getting mixed well into the menstruum for extraction. It also ensures that if there's any plant material that has made its way out of the alcohol and is drying out a little bit, that plant material then gets covered in the alcohol to prevent spoilage of your tincture. So choose a really nice location for your tincture to live during maceration time, and then make sure to remember to go back to the tincture daily if possible, every other day, and give it a shake to make sure that everything is blended well into the menstruum. Now, if you choose to not do a measured method, for instance, if you are simply making medicine that is for your own personal use, another alternative to the measured method is simply the Folk method of maceration. And in the Folk method, you don't need the scales, you don't need the instruments for measuring out your alcohol or your glycerin. It's basically all intuitive use. So for the Folk method, what you would do is pour your plant material into the jar, as much of it as you would like. You definitely want to make sure with Folk method that you don't fill your jar too full. You want to make sure there's still plenty of room to get your alcohol or your glycerin mixed into the plant material. So I like to recommend that if you're filling a jar with the Folk method, that you leave at least a 1/4 inch room at the top of the jar for expansion of the plant material. So put in as much plant material as you'd like for Folk method, and then simply take your menstruum of choice. If you choose to use a grain alcohol, then all you'll do at that second step is just simply pour the alcohol over the plant material until the jar is full or until the plant material is saturated. Then you'll want to mix it up to make sure that all of your plant material has been in contact with your menstruum so that it will extract properly. And then from there, the labeling procedures, the maceration procedures, the shaking of it, those will all stay the same. The only difference for a Folk method is just simply that you don't measure. It's all based on your instinct. Now, Folk method for tincture making is definitely very old-fashioned and very classic. I like to do that for medicine that I know that I'm going to be the only one using. But if you're perhaps creating a tincture that will be used by other patients, or if you are working as a medicine maker in a cannabis center or something of that nature, I really want to suggest that you stay away from Folk method and use the measured method, because that will provide the consistency that patients are after. So you can make the choice for yourself if you're just making medicine in your home, but if you're making medicine for a commercial purpose, or if you're working in a cannabis wellness center, then you'll definitely want to always make your medicine using that measured ratio of 1:5 or 1:10 so that your patients have consistent medicine. So after your plant material has macerated for about 4 weeks, it's time to strain it out. So to strain it out, a few tools are needed. Pretty basic and simple. Cheesecloth is a really handy thing to have around when you're straining a tincture. It allows it has a porous quality to it, so it will allow the liquid to move through the cheesecloth pretty easily, but it's also a tight enough meshwork that it'll trap the plant material and strain that out, and you'll be left only with your medicated glycerin or medicated alcohol. So cheesecloth, you can pick up cheesecloth at most any grocery store. They keep it in a variety of spots, but often grocery stores will have a small section of kitchen tools, and typically they'll have cheesecloth available there. So cheesecloth usually comes on a bolt, kind of like cloth from a cloth store. So unroll the cloth, and depending on the company, you'll find it in a different thickness. So this cheesecloth came, and it was pretty thin. I can see my hand really clearly through the cheesecloth, and that tells me that a lot of plant material is going to make its way through this meshwork. So for the purposes of straining out tinctures, I like to fold the cloth over, and this particular cheesecloth has a little loose, kind of a loose weave, so I'm going to fold it over 2 times to make sure that I get an effective strain on my tincture and I don't have to come back and do this straining a second time. So once you've folded it to a point where you feel pretty confident that it's going to collect all of your plant material, then I like to use just a simple plastic funnel. You can use a stainless steel funnel as well, or glass. Then tuck your cheesecloth in and go ahead and make an indentation so that you have a nice little well inside the funnel for the plant material to pour into. Then you want to choose a jar to collect your plant material. Another mason jar works really nicely. Drop your funnel right into there. Make sure that your cheesecloth has a nice little well inside the funnel. And then pick up your tincture that's been macerating. This particular one is a tincture of thyme. So we're going to strain out our cannabis tincture. And this is also a very simple step. You pour it through, and often as the tincture has been sitting, the plant material will filter down to the bottom, and then that first initial pour is pretty easy. It's just the alcohol moving through, and then you get to the bottom where it's all plant material. And at this point you may need to get a spoon to kind of scrape this out a little. And then set your empty container aside. Now, there's alcohol and medicine still inside this plant material, so it needs to be pressed. A really kind of old-fashioned way of doing it, if you're just making medicine in your home, is to just simply use your hands. After a little bit of time, let the alcohol drain out naturally to save yourself a little wrist and hand strength. Let it drain out naturally. Then gather up the sides of the cheesecloth, and it's nice to kind of make a bundle. And twisting while you squeeze is really helpful. So twist and squeeze, and you can see I'm getting quite a lot of tincture coming out. And this is really exciting because this medicine was actually inside the plant material, which I always find really fascinating when I'm pressing out my medicine and my cannabis or other herbal tinctures. I love to see all that medicine just squeezing right out because I know it's been really intimate with the plant. So give it a good squeeze. Squeeze it as well as you can. Now, some other alternatives to doing this step. If you're going to be making tinctures on a large scale, or if you simply feel like you don't have the hand strength or the ability to do this step, you can find alternative ways to press your tinctures out. Some good alternatives are wine presses. You can also find commercial tincture presses on the market. The drawback to these mechanical presses is that they can often be quite pricey. So if you're trying to be frugal, you probably want to come up with a solution that involves hand pressing. If you're in a situation where you're going to be making a lot of medicine and you need to order a press, you can look online and find all kinds of options in the tincture press and wine press categories that will help you out. So after you've strained your material out, put your lid back on, and now you have a finished tincture product. On this finished product, you also want to put that same label information that was on the tincture when it was macerating. So that information is the name of the plant, which would be cannabis, the strains that were used in the production, the ratio that you created your tincture in, 1:5, 1:10, the menstruum that you used, Everclear, vodka, glycerin, and then the date. So for storage of the finished product of tinctures, it's also important to store that in a cool, dark place. You can store them in mason jars if you'd like, but often people choose to use dark colored glass. Amber or blue colored glass is really ideal for long-term storage of a strained tincture. These darker colored glasses will help to filter out light and will help to preserve your tincture so that it stays fresh and viable for a longer amount of time. When you're storing your tincture in a dark colored glass, a common bottle type is called a Boston round. And it's known in the herbal industry as basically a great storage container for herbal extractions like tinctures. So here's an example of what a Boston round looks like. It's a small one. This is a 1 ounce. So if you're making a large amount of tincture, like we've pressed out here, they make Boston rounds in a variety of sizes. You can get 1/2 ounce Boston rounds all the way up to 32 ounce Boston rounds. So if you do a little shopping around, you're sure to come across a supplier of these bottles. So it's a great idea to have some of these Boston rounds on hand to store large amounts of tincture in, but also having smaller bottles around with dropper tops. That's a great way to keep a small amount of the tincture with you for dosage. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about tincture dosage. You can get a lot more information about just tincture therapy in general by visiting our Cannabis Therapy Fundamentals course. We go quite in depth to different kinds of cannabis therapy, smoke therapy, tincture therapy, topical therapy, and the application of cannabis in these forms. So I want to just briefly go over what tincture dosage looks like. So often you'll want to keep your tincture in a Boston round with a dropper top. 1 ounce is really a convenient size. It travels well in people's, like a purse or a bag when you're moving around. So typically, a dosage for a tincture When it has a dropper top on it, you squeeze the plunger at the top, and when you release it, it fills this tube with your tincture medicine. So for some people who are quite sensitive to cannabis medicine, a few drops may be all that they need, especially of an alcohol extract. A few drops may be sufficient for their needs for pain relief or relaxation or sleep. So a few drops would look like gently squeezing the top plunger just to let a couple drops come out at a time. Now, some people who need stronger doses or larger doses of cannabis will be fine with taking a full dropper, one dropper, to maybe 2 or 3, depending on what their situation is, what their physical needs may be. So tinctures are a really convenient way to deliver a consistent dosage of cannabis. They're really convenient to travel with and quite discreet. You don't need to store these in a refrigerator. Some people will ask whether it's necessary to keep your tinctures refrigerated. Especially an alcohol tincture, you're not going to need to worry about spoilage once it's strained. The alcohol is a very effective preservative, and it's very rare to have anything like mold or bacteria or anything growing inside of your alcohol tincture. Vinegar tinctures are also pretty stable. Vinegar is not a great extractor of cannabis, so it's not such a concern for this particular demonstration. But many people who don't want to make alcohol extractions also make their cannabis tinctures using glycerin. And glycerin, for all practical purposes, is also fairly stable and does not need to be refrigerated once you've strained out the medicine. Glycerin's fairly stable. Now, a little bit of a discussion between alcohol and glycerin tinctures. Alcohol tinctures tend to be quite a lot stronger than glycerin tinctures. Alcohol is a much more effective extractor of THC and other cannabis constituents. Glycerin is less effective at extracting these medicines. So chemically speaking, glycerin is considered an alcohol. It's in the chemical class of alcohols. But let's say a comparison: on one end of the spectrum we have water. On the other end of the spectrum, we have alcohol. And we're working with, in this particular demonstration, we were working with grain alcohol that was 95%. So our Everclear is extracting way over here at the edge, kind of close to 100% alcohol. It's very effective for cannabis medicine making. Glycerin kind of falls in the middle here. It tends to be closer to a relation of maybe 60% alcohol. So whereas an alcohol tincture is maybe half a dropper full to 2 dropper fulls as a standard dose, with a glycerin tincture you may need to bump that up to 1 dropper full. I've seen the glycerin tinctures go as high as the suggested doses of 6 dropper fulls. So you'll want to play around with your medicine and get comfortable with its strength, knowing that alcohol is likely to be quite a lot stronger than the glycerin extractions. So that's the basics of tincture making. It's really simple. It's really satisfying to be able to make your own extractions, to use medicine that you're perhaps creating for yourself, growing your own plant material. It's really a simple procedure. It will benefit you so many times over to make your own medicine. It's a fantastic way to connect with the plant and to really place your energy and instinct and intuition into your medicine for your benefit and for the benefit of other patients that may be working with the things that you create. So I want to talk a little bit about the therapeutic uses for an alcohol tincture, why you may wish to take cannabis in this form. So one of the main reasons that people often go to alcohol tinctures or glycerin tinctures is for convenience. It's easy to put a bottle of cannabis tincture into a purse or a bag and carry it around with you for small doses of medicine as you need it through the day. It's also quite discreet. Often people need the use of cannabis throughout the day, but they're not in a position where smoke therapy is available to them. So having a tincture is a wonderful alternative to smoke therapy. More specifically, though, tinctures really tend to address physical body pain to a deeper level. Tinctures are often kind of akin to an edible therapy in terms of its effect. They tend to relax the physical body to a deeper degree, offering relief from muscle pain, joint pain, all kinds of conditions that have some sort of discomfort in the physical body. A tincture is a really beautiful way to deliver cannabis medicine and really address those symptoms. So tinctures can be taken internally to address physical discomfort, but also they can be used topically. There are several old folk remedies from Mexico, South America, where people would extract cannabis into alcohol and rub that as what's called a liniment on the physical body. So tinctures can be very effective taken internally, but also they can be applied topically to a sore wrist or elbow or knee or muscles. A lot of people I've heard will use cannabis tinctures on their back for back pains. And the alcohol does absorb into the skin to a certain degree and offer quite a lot of relief when used topically. When you take a tincture internally, as I said, they have a similar effect to an edible in that it relaxes the body. But the benefit of working with a tincture as opposed to an edible is that it's much easier to control dosage. One of the common complaints with edible therapy is that the dosage for that particular therapy is so dramatically variant from one edible to another. So for a patient that needs that deep body relaxation that can be given through edible therapy, but the patient is perhaps having trouble getting the right dosage down, they may want to try an alcohol extract taken internally. It tends to really relax the body quite nicely, and it has less of a psychoactive effect than edibles do. But sleep disabilities are also really relieved with alcohol tinctures. People who have problems with insomnia get quite a lot of relief by taking a cannabis tincture in the evening before bed. It can bring a really wonderful, relaxed sleep to that patient. It's also really appropriate in addressing reproductive complaints for women, menstrual cramps and things of that nature. Cannabis is a wonderful plant for assisting with women's reproductive health. So if you would like to explore the therapeutic use of tinctures and other cannabis forms to a deeper degree, I really encourage you to visit us at our Cannabis Therapy Fundamentals class. In that class, we go over all different forms of cannabis in a deep discussion of how to use those forms like smoke therapy, tincture therapy, edible therapy, and how to tailor that therapeutic picture for a patient. So to start, let's talk a little bit about what benefits a patient can expect from using a cannabis extract topically. So for most people, when they think about cannabis therapy, they think about smoking, they think about edibles, may even think about tinctures and a variety of other forms. But topical cannabis therapy is a really fantastic way to deliver pain relief for patients. So patients that have struggles with joint pain, such as arthritis or muscular pain and tension, muscle knots, these sorts of situations, just tense body in general, cannabis therapy topically can be really fantastically relieving to these symptoms. One of the benefits of this is that cannabis therapy, when used topically, has little to no effect on the mental faculties. So if a patient is, for instance, needing to function during the day and interact with others, but they're experiencing a large amount of physical pain, using a cannabis-infused oil on their skin or on their body, or a cannabis-infused salve can be a wonderful way to deliver pain relief without affecting their cognitive function. Today we're going to be infusing, as I said, in olive oil. The oil that we're using today is an organic extra virgin olive oil. And I want to talk a little bit about oils for just a moment here. Now this is of course a really beautiful oil to use an organic olive oil and to use the extra virgin, which is considered a higher quality. For the purposes of topical application, it's not always necessary to use such a lovely olive oil. If it's available to you, it's always a great idea to use quality oils, but a standard quality olive oil that's not extra virgin is acceptable for a topical application. If you're wanting to infuse cannabis in an olive oil for internal use, then I really recommend that you get a really nice high quality oil like an organic extra virgin. But just a side note that you don't have to have that level of quality for topical application. The reason that we're using olive oil is because it's kind of a standard oil that most herbal medicine makers will use in their herbal extractions. So When I make medicines of lavender or sage or thyme or rose, I always extract into olive oil, mainly because it's a fairly stable oil at room temperature. It can handle a moderate amount of heat. It has a nice shelf life, and it's also just a really nice oil on the skin. It provides a lot of nutrients to the skin and a lot of good fats. But as I said before, it's not the only oil you can extract in. There are a number of other possibilities, and I encourage you to explore those possibilities using that herbal artist's creativity. So extra virgin olive oil is our medium for today. The other thing that we'll be using today as a cannabis substitute is sage. So we'll be extracting sage into our extra virgin olive oil. So I want to give you a quick rundown of some tools that you'll need for this extraction process. A double boiler is necessary to heat all of your plant material and your oil together so that you can effectively extract the medicine into the oil. I like to use a crock pot as my double boiler in this situation because a crock pot offers a nice gentle heat. A grinder is also something that can be useful so that you can grind your plant material up into a finer powder consistency so it will extract to a greater degree. You might need a scale. These scales are easy to pick up at like an office supply store. You can find just postage scales. I recommend you find one that has the capability of doing ounces or grams so that you can work within the ounce system that most of us are familiar with, or if you'd like to work in the metric system, that's available to you as well. And then just a variety of mason jars. A great thing to have on hand too is some kind of measuring cup. Pyrex is a really common one that's found in most kitchens, and Pyrex offers ounce measurements on one side and milliliters on another, so it's a versatile tool for this type of medicine making. Now, some people may ask, what type of cannabis do you want to use for your oil extractions? So you can use any combination of sweet leaf or trim, small kind of scrappy buds, or really lovely, beautiful buds from your plant. Any combination of those, all sweet leaf trim or all bud or a blend of things in between. Now typically bud infusions are said to be a little bit stronger because there's a little bit more resin captured inside those buds. But you can make a really effective oil extraction using the trim and the sweet leaf. And in fact, that's what most people reserve these clippings for, is to use them as oil extractions. So when you set into the kitchen to make your infused oil, the first step that you'll want to do is grind it up. So as I said, you'll want to have a nice grinder. Just a small coffee grinder is sufficient for most people's uses in their kitchen. I do recommend that you don't use a coffee grinder that has also been used for grinding coffee, because it will leave the coffee oils in your cannabis. It won't be a pure cannabis extract. You'll have a little coffee in there too. So if you're going to be making cannabis medicine, it's a really good idea to have a separate grinder set aside for your cannabis medicine making, and it's used exclusively for that. So grinding your medicine up before you extract it is a good idea. It's a good idea because it reduces the particle size and allows more plant material to be available for extraction in the oil, so you'll get a more complete extraction of your plant material. So I have some sage ground up today as our cannabis stand-in. When you're making oil infusions, there are a couple of ways to go about it, and I want to talk about those ways. One way is to do a measured method. Now, for some of you who have participated in the Cannabis Therapy Institute's tincture making class, you may be familiar with this measured method, which basically is a ratio of extraction, saying that you have 1 part of plant material to a common ratio for oil extractions would be 15 or 20 parts oil. So if you're familiar with making tinctures within the measured ratio, oil extractions require less plant material to extract into the oil. It comes out fairly easily into the oil, so you don't need to use it at those concentrated ratios of a 1:5 or a 1:10. You certainly could if you chose to. For our purposes today, we're going to be extracting our oil in a 1:15 ratio. So when you're working into that ratio, the 1 basically can represent any part. The 1 is the herb by weight. So you can have 1 ounce, you could have that be 1 pound. If you're working in grams, you could have the 1 be representative of 28 grams. You could have it be representative of 228 grams. It doesn't really matter as long as that's the part that you're using that's weighed out of the plant material. So you take that part and then multiply it by the other half of the ratio. So since we're working in a 1:15 ratio today, you would take whatever herb you have by weight and multiply it by 15. We're going to be doing 28 grams of our cannabis stand-in sage. So 28 grams of sage multiplied by 15 is 420 milligrams, or I'm sorry, 420 milliliters. So I'm sure that that's very interesting and amusing to all of you. I definitely got a snicker out of it. So we'll have 28 grams of our plant material by weight to 420 milliliters of our oil. So I've already ground things up. We'll get started by simply weighing the plant material and putting it into a mason jar. So for extraction, a mason jar is a really great tool to have for oil extractions. Mason jars can tolerate heat fairly nicely, and they're easy to open and close so that you can have access to your medicine as you're infusing it. So I get out my scale, just the simple postage scale that I got from the office supply store, and I'm going to zero out the scale. And then add 28 grams of my plant material. Okay, so I've got 28 grams of plant material. I'm going to take this jar and set it aside. The next thing to do is to measure out your oil. So for a 1:15 with 28 grams as our plant weight, we're going to measure out 420 milliliters of olive oil. So as you're pouring your oil into the container, you may need to give it a little stir to make sure that you have plenty of space to pour all the oil in. So after you've measured your oil out and poured it into your container, you definitely want to take a minute to stir this up. There's oftentimes, as you're stirring, you'll find little pockets of dry plant material inside this oil. So it's really essential that you stir and make sure that all of your plant material is completely saturated with the oil. This will improve the extraction, making sure that all of the cannabis plant material is available to the oil to pull out its healing qualities. So after you feel pretty confident that your oil and your plant material are stirred effectively together, then you can put the lid on. Now at this point, you want to begin infusing the plant with the double boiler. So I'm going to bring out the crock pot. This is my favorite way to infuse oils because it offers nice, gentle, consistent heat. If you create a double boiler on the stove, you can have an effective extraction, but it requires a little more attention to make sure that your water's not heating up too high, to make sure that you're not getting a really intense heat on the jar. You do want to remember that you're infusing oil, and oil is susceptible to heat. So too much heat for most oils can cause the oil to go rancid. So you want to ensure that this is a nice, gentle, warming water bath, probably not much more than about 200 degrees, maybe even a little lower than that. And that will be an ideal medium for gently extracting your plant material. So you want to fill your crock pot with water. I like to turn the crock pot on high at first to get the water going. One tip that I can offer you here is you never want to heat up this water and then place a cold jar in already hot water. I've had some messy experiences with placing a cold jar in hot water and having it crack. So not only is that messy, but it's incredibly sad to see that you've lost your cannabis olive oil into the water because your jar is cracked. So it's a good idea to submerge your jar into the water bath while the water is still cool and the jar is still cool, then they can heat up together and you won't have that potential problem of having your jar crack. So turning your water on low, high, medium, whatever your crock pot settings offer, but again, you want to make sure that it's a nice consistent heat of somewhere between 180 to 200 degrees is pretty ideal. You want to also ensure that you have enough water inside your crock pot to cover comfortably your jar. So we're making a small amount of oil today. So I would say that we want the water level to be about 3/4 of the way up this jar. It's really important to not completely submerge the jar because we want to make sure that we're keeping a really nice separation between the water in our double boiler and the oil inside of our jar. Basically what we know is oil and water don't mix very well. So if water gets introduced into your oil, the potential problems that exist with that scenario are your oil could potentially turn rancid. You could get growth of bacteria or mold or something in here that you don't want with the mixture of the water and the oil together. So it's really important that you keep your jar a nice separation between the top of your jar and the top of the water line. So again, about 3/4 of the way. So you'll put the jar into the water, turn your heat on, let it heat up to a nice warm temperature, and then from here it's a process of kind of just consistently checking on the crock pot. You want to be stirring your oil every 15 minutes for something small like this to every 30 or 45 minutes for larger containers. This ensures that you get a nice even heat throughout instead of having simply the cannabis and the olive oil along the outer edges of your jar warm while the core is still cool and not extracting well. So you want to stir it every 15 minutes for something like this. If you're extracting in larger quantities, like a gallon at a time, every 30 to 45 minutes is appropriate. When you come in to stir, you definitely want to have a towel handy, and you definitely want to have something to protect your hands from heat. So, you know, with this, we actually don't have something on here, so I can pick this up easily. But if this were full of hot water, you would want an oven mitt or a towel to protect your hands from scalding. So you lift it out of the crock pot, then you want to set it down on the counter and wipe it off. And again, the reason you're wiping this jar off is to make sure that the condensation from the hot water that's collected on the rim of your jar doesn't get into the jar when you open it up. So you take it out, give it a quick wipe. You want to do this step as quickly as you can because you don't want your jar to cool. Open it up, give it a stir, check on it. It's a great opportunity to smell the medicine so you get an idea of how it smells as it's extracting. One of the greatest tools for a medicine maker in terms of being creative is their senses. So the sense of smell is really engaged when you're making an infused oil because that warm energy inside the oil really brings out the cannabis aroma. One of the ways that you can kind of tell that an oil is done cooking is when it begins to smell done. And it's really hard to describe what that is. Bakers often have this experience where they just sort of know the cookies are done before the timer goes off because they can smell them. The same instincts will begin to be developed in you as you make your oil infusions if you begin to exercise that. So every time you go in to stir your medicine, give it a smell and see how it's smelling. And eventually, if you make enough batches of these, you will kind of get that internal timer that will say, the oil is finished. While you're developing that skill, it's a good idea to have some idea of how long you want to infuse this medicine. So a standard infusion time can vary quite dramatically depending on the size of the jar that you're infusing. So for something like this is a pint mason jar. Something this size, I would say the infusion time for this could be, anywhere from 3 to 4 hours. Whereas if you're making something that's a full gallon, you may need to infuse for as long as 7 or 8 hours to effectively extract that cannabis. The time varies because of the volume that you're trying to heat. When you're heating a smaller volume of plant material and oil, less time is needed for that heat to penetrate all the way through the plant material and oil mixture to extract the medicine. So you'll begin to develop that creative herbal artist's knowing of when your oil is ready to be pulled out of the hot water bath. So once you have reached the point where you feel your oil is finished extracting, the thing to do is turn off your crock pot, take your oil out of the bath, set the crock pot aside, and from here, I like to just give the oil a little time. I give it one final stir, so make sure to wipe the condensation off your jar, take the lid off, give it one final stir, then put the lid back on and let it sit and cool to room temperature. And during this process, the plant material will begin to settle out, settling down to the bottom, and this will really be something you're grateful for when it comes time to strain your oil, to have it kind of self-strain a little bit. So we're going to be demonstrating the straining procedure with an oil that we've already extracted. This is a dandelion leaf olive oil. So I'm not sure if you can see on film or not, because the dandelion is fairly dark. I'll put something white behind. But at any rate, the plant material has settled to the bottom here. So this is going to make our straining really much, much easier. So I like to take the oil out of the hot water bath, give it a stir, and then, as I said, let it settle and cool. This process can be anywhere from a few hours to a day or so. If I'm infusing larger batches of cannabis olive oil, I like to take my oil out of the water bath and let it settle for at least 24 hours before I strain it out. That gives it time to cool. It continues to extract a little bit more, and then the plant material settles down and makes my experience in straining out the oil from the plant material a lot faster. So let's go over that process. You definitely want to have an appropriate sized container to collect your oil. And again, mason jars are kind of the herbal medicine maker's best friend. So if you've extracted in a pint mason jar, then you'll want a pint mason jar around so that you can strain your oil into that. A funnel is also a really helpful tool. You can use a plastic funnel, a stainless steel funnel, a glass funnel. It doesn't really matter. The funnel just provides a nice cup for putting your cheesecloth in. And cheesecloth is a really handy thing to have for straining. I want to talk a little bit about cheesecloth. You can find cheesecloth at your local grocery store. They typically keep it in the section where there's a few kitchen tools available. There should be cheesecloth available there. And this cheesecloth comes on a bolt, folded up kind of like you would get cloth at a fabric store. This particular cheesecloth has a pretty loose weave. When I unrolled it straight from the bolt, I can see my hand clearly through the cheesecloth. So that tells me that this is a little bit too porous for effectively straining out my oil. What I will find if I just simply lay the cheesecloth in as is that we'll have a lot of plant material that strains through and gets into the oil, and I'll have to strain it a second time. So with this kind of cheesecloth, I like to fold it over, not once, but twice, to make sure that I'm not going to have any particles floating around in my oil. This will, by having this thick cheesecloth, it will take a little longer to strain out the oil, but it'll be worth it in the end to not have to go back and do this process a second time. So you'll take your funnel. It's important to put your cheesecloth in. Give it a poke so that you make a nice well, and so the cheesecloth is ready to accept the oil when you pour it in. If you've got the cheesecloth stretched across the top like this, especially with oil, it probably will bounce off this and roll onto your counter, and you'll lose precious cannabis oil. So just take your fingers and poke down and make a nice little well in the funnel with the cheesecloth. Place that funnel and cheesecloth into your collecting container. Then you want to get your cooled and settled oil infusion. And from here it's pretty simple. You just pour the oil off The first experience of this here will be pretty simple because this oil is kind of already self-strained. So we'll pour our oil through, and you can see it starting to collect down below. So after you've poured some of the oil through, you kind of get to the part where all of the plant material is concentrated at the bottom of your jar. So it's good to have a spoon handy so you can scrape this plant material into this nice well that you've made here. So this plant material does have quite a bit of medicinal oil left in it, and you'll want to strain that out, press that out of the plant material. And this particular part of the oil is really exciting to me because this oil has actually been inside the plant material. And I feel like it collects so much valuable medicine. So you really want to take the time to make that step and squeeze out, press out the oil from that. So after you've put the plant material in, most of your oil has already come through. As you can see, we have quite a large amount of oil, but there's still some oil dripping. It's coming through from this collection of plant material. So I like to give it a little stir, giving the plant and the oil and the cheesecloth the opportunity to kind of strain a little more. It saves my hands from squeezing and wringing so much. But you get to a point where there's only so much that can be done with a spoon, and it's time to start pressing. So to do that, you just simply want to gather the sides of your cheesecloth together, make a little bundle, and then twisting is a really helpful procedure. So twist the bottom, and as you can see, look at all that oil that comes spilling out. So that's all oil that's inside your plant material. So you definitely want to do this pressing step because this is really strong medicine that's coming out. So with oil pressing, it's a little more challenging than tincture pressing. The oil tends to kind of stay put inside the plant material and the cheesecloth. And I've noticed that I do lose a few, some volume from when I make it. If I used, let's say, 420 milliliters, when I press it out, I'm not going to necessarily get 420 out because some of it is trapped in the cloth and some of it will stay in the plant as well. So you want to give it a nice squeeze, use your strength, and then set this aside. And now you have a really beautiful, strong, cannabis-infused olive oil. I want to talk a little bit here about some alternative pressing options. If pressing out the cannabis using your hands and squeezing and wringing that cheesecloth is something that is challenging for you, you can look into purchasing a press. Wine presses are useful. There's also presses that are meant for tincture pressing that you can find if you do an online search, or perhaps there's a store near you that sells these items. They are potentially a little pricey, so it's a little bit of an investment. But if you're going to be making a lot of oils, it's probably an investment that you'll be glad you made. So even if you purchase a press that's meant for tinctures or wine, chances are it will be really ideal for also pressing out infused oils. That will also decrease the amount of oil that you lose because you'll get much more out when you press it through a machine press than through a hand press. There's still quite a lot of medicine in here that I wasn't able to get out simply because I wasn't able to have the leverage and the strength to do it. So just something to think about if you're going to be manufacturing or producing quite a lot of oil. You'll want to look for a press. So this was a measured method of infusing oil. Just like tinctures, there's also the alternative folk style method. In the folk style method, what you would do is simply grind up however much plant material you want to use, place that into a jar, and then pour the intuitive desired amount of olive oil or coconut oil or whatever your oil is into the jar and infuse it without measuring. Now that kind of oil infusion is appropriate if you're just simply making medicine for yourself and you're not sharing it with other patients. But if you're working as a caregiver, you're working in a cannabis center, making medicines for other patients, it's really important to work within the measured method so then your medicine has consistency. So once your medicine is pressed out, you're left with this plant material here. And it's often hard for people to let go of this, thinking, what can I do with this? It feels like so much cannabis. I will say that most of the healing qualities, most of the constituents in the cannabis plant are in your oil. They've come out here. So this now is a potent medicine. And this is, probably has a little bit of something to offer. But for the most part, if you've extracted it in a strong extraction process like we've demonstrated here, the plant's given most of its medicine over to the oil. So some people say, can I cook with this? Could I put this in a soup? Could I put this in some kind of savory dish? You can certainly try that, and you might have some medicinal effect from doing that, but you have to use quite a lot of this in order to get that effect, so it might really alter the flavor of your dish. But you can certainly experiment with that. I will say, though, that you probably will find that it's not as effective as your oil. So it's okay to let this plant material go. It's done its job well. So now you have an infused oil, and in this case we have an infused olive oil. And our intention with this infusion was to make medicine for topical use. So this oil can now be used as a massage base. You can add essential oils to it. You could blend this cannabis oil infusion with other herbal infused oils like lavender or rose to help relax the body and create a really nice massage experience. So you can infuse this oil into a salve. Salves are really an ideal way to deliver topical cannabis medicine because they're really easy to use, convenient to carry along with you in a purse or a bag, and a little less messy than a massage oil. Massage oil definitely has its therapeutic benefit. If you're trying to cover large areas of the body that need cannabis medicine delivered topically, you definitely want to think about using a massage oil because it's going to spread better and you'll be able to get a lot more out of your oil. If it's liquid, you'll be able to cover more area and use a little less oil. But if you just kind of need spot treatments for, let's say, a knee or an elbow, or you need to carry your medicine along with you in a bag and you're worried that a bottle of oil might leak, a salve is a really beautiful alternative. Your handouts have, in the handout at the bottom, a recipe for making salves. It's a really simple procedure. Basically, you set up a double boiler, heat the oil, the infused cannabis oil, and add beeswax. Stir that up until the beeswax is melted and pour it into a container. The ratios for herbal salve making is a teaspoon of your beeswax to your oil infusion. It's really simple, really standard. You can do that pretty quickly in your kitchen. You can get creative here too. This is another area where your herbal artist can shine by adding other ingredients in the salve, cocoa butter, other oil infusions, essential oils, whatever you like. Or you can just stick with the basic cannabis infused oil hardened with beeswax, and you'll have a really effective and beautiful medicine. So that's the basics of oil infusion. I really hope that you are excited about the idea of creating cannabis medicines, about creating a beautiful oil extraction that can be used for salves and massage oils. So thank you for joining me, Deanna Gabriel with Cannabis Therapy Institute. We'll see you next time.